The subject is not coffee and cigarettes. That's just a pretext for showing the underdramatic part of your day when you take a break and use these drugs or whatever. It's a pretext for getting characters together to talk in this sort of throwaway period of their day. Those are words from director Jim Jarmusch on his 2003 film Coffee and Cigarettes. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer. And each week I invite a guest on to discuss the film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia and Renée. Today we're talking Coffee and Cigarettes. So a quick synopsis of the film is a series of vignettes that all have coffee and cigarettes in common. Now, as this is a film told in 11 different vignettes, there's a very large cast. I won't go through all of them here, but we will be going through them as we discuss them in this episode. It's written by Jim Jarmusch, cinematography by Tom DiCillo, Frederick Elms, Alan Caress, and Robbie Mueller, directed by Jim Jarmusch, and edited by Jim Jarmusch, Terry Katz, Melody London, and Jay Rabinowitz. Today, my guest is Trevor Young, and I know Trevor from the Royal Film Club, where he's also a member. But before we get into his background in film and his interest in Jarmusch, I just want to say thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited to have you on.
Yeah, I will take any opportunity I can to talk about Jim and his lovely movies.
Right? Yeah, I mean, when I was doing the Jarmusch month, you're one of the first people I thought of, and I was so glad that you said yes, because I knew that you were a Jarmusch head.
That makes me happy to hear.
I am interested, though, before we get into the film, to hear a bit more about your background and how you got into watching films on a more quote unquote serious level.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, I've always been a big film person since I was very small. I don't work in the film industry necessarily. I work in podcasts professionally, like in the audio space. But, films have always been like the thing I'm most interested in my personal life. So, as a kid, I think I was really lucky to have a mom who like took me to real movies and like art house stuff very frequently. She would she took me to see Princess Mononoke when it came out when I was like 5 years old in like 98. Right. And so she had never had any qualms about taking me to like experience real art at a very young age. So that has always kind of like stuck with me. And I took a bunch of film classes throughout middle school, high school, and college, which, just bolstered my love of cinema. And, I think, again, just something I've carried with me into my adult years. And then a couple of years ago, I moved to Los Angeles, which has done wonders. As a film person, this is like the best place all here. Everything's happening. You have so many like revival cinema houses here. New Beverly, American Cinematheque are all here. So it's just like a lovely place to be a fan of film. And yes, especially since the pandemic too. I've just been going hard in the paint, just really trying to watch like 15 to 20 movies a month, just go into as many screenings as I can. And yeah, it's great. Being a part of Arroyo is great too, because it, introduces me to stuff I maybe would never think about watching. So,
right.
Yeah.
No, that's cool. I love hearing about people's kind of beginnings, and especially if it involves their parents, because I think that's so important. Because it could go either way. You could just be like, I hate that my parent introduced me to this, or
totally,
you become who you are. I was the same way. So that's how I became who I am, just because my parents are both, big movie heads too. Exactly. But LA, I love, also been there several times. And it's always just like, I always see like you or Gregor and and everyone else in the club posting about all the screenings they're going to and like who's there. And I'm just like, oh my God. Like I would scream if I saw Wim Wenders or Werner Herzog.
That was a good one.
So.
Yep. It's a privilege for sure. I mean, it's great.
But we're here to talk about Coffee and Cigarettes today. Do you recall the first time you watched it and what your initial thoughts were on that watch?
I do. And thank you for letting me pick this one too, because, I could have picked a more conventional film from his filmography. And this one has just been an important one for me for a while. So to answer your question, I first saw this, I think when I was 13 or 14, probably like circa 2005, 2006. And it was like on demand. I was like staying with my dad one summer, like summer break. And he had like, I don't know what it was called back then, like TiVo or something. And it was just there. It was just like a thing I found kind of accidentally. And I remember watching this and just being so compelled and entertained by it as a 13, 14-year-old. And I think the thing I was compelled by was just how weird it was and how
Hmm.
like kind of liminal and goofy the whole thing appeared to be. And because I was 13, 14, I think the like vignette nature of this movie was good for me, right? It was like an attention span thing of a 13-year-old that I was able to like get through and also super like get something out of it. And since that time, I've like revisited it every couple of years. And then a couple of years ago, like maybe 5 years ago, I got really hard into Jarmusch, and this is the one that like always just like stands at the top for me. Maybe for nostalgia reasons, but also just
Hmm.
there's so much to love about this movie. I think like in many ways, this is like the quintessential or archetype of his style. It's a really good entry point for a lot of people, and I think it was a great entry point for me.
I think that's great. I definitely did not start watching Jarmusch as early as 13, so that's like really cool that you
It
got
was
to
an
see him
accident. It
so
was totally
early.
an accident. Yeah.
Sometimes it's the way it needs to be. And I definitely agree that it's one that stands test of time. And over the course of the times that I've watched it, every time I see it, a new vignette is my favorite, which I'm sure we'll get
Hmm.
into. Which one is maybe your favorite? Which one do you love the most? But you said that you got more into his stuff after watching this one. What's your kind of relationship to Jarmusch? Obviously, I know you love him, but how do you view his body of work?
It's interesting. The next time I saw Jarmusch was actually like on an episode of, I think, Parts Unknown was the show. It was Anthony Bourdain's show where he went to New York and he like interviewed a bunch of just kind of like artists and makers in New York, and Jarmusch was one of those people. And I was like, oh man, this guy's cool. And then I like realized like, oh, that's the coffee and cigarettes guy. This is probably like circa 2016, 2017,
Hmm.
and it just kind of like put me on a path to like learning more about his movies. Remembering Coffee and Cigarettes and how much I loved it. And it's funny because I do think that episode of Bourdain is like a pretty representative of like the kind of person he is. He's very much this 70s 80s New York
Hmm.
CBGB punk musician. Like he kind of comes from this very like dusty analog background,
Hmm.
and everything he does is intentionally so kind of slow, kind of low budget, and again has this kind of like punk aesthetic to it, that is again very like New York and very dirty.
Hmm.
And I think that's what I love most about it is just it comes off always so raw and so real, like everything he does, because he's just kind of has this ethos of grassroots filmmaking that
Yeah.
has very, again, small budgets, but has a lot of heart, and more than anything is there to have fun, I think.
Yeah, I think that's like the common theme of what I've been saying to a lot of guests that I think on the surface people think that Jarmusch is very serious because a lot of his stuff is a bit slower and it's mainly a lot of people talking. But if you actually watch his films, they're quite fun and he's
Mhm.
very funny. Like the scripts are very funny. And this one's very funny too.
Exactly. Yeah, there's like a sense of humor, like even in the more serious stuff. Like I don't think he's ever taking himself that seriously, to be honest.
No, I don't think so either. He seems
Yeah.
just like the most chill guy.
Yeah, he's got this kind of like bohemian thing where you just expect him to be like leaning against like a shitty brick building
Yeah.
on a street corner and on the like Upper West Side, smoking a cigarette in a leather jacket. I don't know. I just like I've always like really related to him and his sort of style and his aesthetic. It just kind of works for me. There's something about it that like I could see myself hanging out with this person or being like him or whatever it is.
I just have always loved his vibe from the first film that I ever saw until
What was the first film you saw?
Down by Law, actually. No, it
Okay.
was Stranger Than Paradise, sorry. And then right after I saw Down by Law. Yeah, I think I had known about Jarmusch and was like, okay, let me start from the beginning. So but I always think of Down by Law as being the first one because I think that's where it really cemented to me,
Hmm.
I love what he's doing. Well, if you're ready to talk about coffee and cigarettes, I know we've touched upon it a little bit, but we can get into the film itself.
Absolutely.
For the listeners anyone who's been listening has listened to it, I do typically go less story-wise, but with this one, I think it's important to talk about the different segments, the different vignettes in this. So I'm going to switch it up a little bit. We're going to talk about some stuff at the beginning, and then we'll get into each, segment. There's the 11. We'll just briefly chat about each one. But before we get into the segments directly, just want to talk about how this was shot over the course of 17 years. And certain segments were shot for different reasons. Like the first one with Roberto Benigni was shot technically for SNL, and that was a short there. And there's been other, like the Twins segment was also shot at the same time that he shot Mystery Train, because he was like, well, I've got people here, I've got Robbie Mueller, let's just shoot this other thing I've been thinking of. And then over the course of those years, he shot more and more and then assembled it to be Coffee and Cigarette. With that, though, we're getting different cinematographers, we're getting different editors, and we're getting different actors, obviously. How do you feel that they meld together? Do you find, yes, there are segments, but visually, do you find that it comes together smoothly, or do you find some of them a little jarring as you're watching it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question because, he definitely didn't have, I think, the intent to sew them together into a movie from the very beginning, from the outset, right? It was something that probably midway along the process, he was like, hey, this could all be part of a bigger thing here. So the way I see it is that, yes, each one's kind of like different in some ways, visually and tonally, but it's almost like watching Boyhood or something, where it's like you kind of see this thing evolve over a long period of time. And so it's not jarring to me because like the evolution makes sense. Like it makes sense that like going from the 90s to the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s, that like he would be evolving as a filmmaker, and that, he would be using better cameras and different people. And, the fact that he was able to maintain enough awareness that, he needed to have some cohesiveness across this timeline, to me is, if anything, just super impressive. And again, the differences don't bother me because they make sense in the context of taking almost 20 years to make, right? I don't know, that's the way I see it.
I definitely agree. Because as you said, like he would be evolving, just not even just him, but like technology is evolving throughout those like 3 decades that we're getting. So it's really cool to have that body of work under your belt. I think, looking back, I'm sure that if I was a filmmaker who did this, I'd be like, it's really cool that I get to see who I was then,
exactly
till now. So yeah, I mean, they do look different, but like it's not, and I definitely didn't find it jarring in any sense. I think there's some, for me, just because I'm such a huge Robbie Mueller fan, where I'm like, okay, I know that's him that shot it versus the other cinematographers, but it's not like the other ones are lesser than. I think it's each segment fits the way it looks visually, and I just love that. And you get the benefit of being like, okay, well, these are all different little stories, so they don't really need to all look exactly the same.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I do think like each one, if different, like as you said, like matches the time period, matches like where he was at the time. I like it for that reason. I think again, it's just like amazing that somewhere along the line he had the foresight to kind of keep certain elements consistent throughout each of them so that it, still felt like a movie by the end of it. Like the fact that it does actually feel like a movie, that all of these were somehow intentional after you've gotten through all 11 of them, is to me something to be very proud of. It's quite a feat.
I don't know how many people watching it would realize that it was shot over that course of time, unless you're like looking at the actors and be like, that's not what they look like in 2003. But
yeah, I actually didn't know the first time I watched this. I learned that later.
I definitely didn't the first time I watched it. So that's really cool. But in doing preparations for this and reading people's thoughts on the film, there's usually, I think the sentiment is mirrors our sentiment, but there are people who think that obviously certain segments are not their favorites, or they find it a bit slow because it's like just these little conversations. Some of them don't go anywhere, some of them do. I think what makes it so watchable for me, even though I don't find it boring at all, but I could see obviously other people might. I think what makes him watchable is the humor that runs throughout. And we were talking about his humor and like the actors that he picks, because he always picks his actors first before he even really had the full story.
Totally. Yeah.
And he often were comedians or even musicians. And I think the humor running throughout all of these segments is what makes it watchable. But kind of how you feel about that, and you're watching all these different little conversations and how it moves the story along, despite the fact that they're not linked in any way.
Yeah, I mean, I find every single one of these to be very entertaining, because each one takes, I think, what are like natural quirks of these individuals and these actors and just like jacks it up to 11. You know, like Roberto Benigni is already like a weird
Yeah.
guy, but he's like so weird in this to the point where it's just how can you not be entertained? Like he's just so charming to watch. Be
Yeah.
like a kind of anxious, kooky guy. You know, I'm sure we'll talk about the actual vignette in a second, but like across the board, I think that holds true, right? Is that like, you know, I don't know, how can you watch Jack White and Meg White like talk about a Tesla coil and not be like totally engrossed by the fact that this even exists? You know what I
Right.
mean? I have a lot of nostalgia for the early 2000s, and to like see that on film, those two
Mhm.
people in a room doing this completely silly thing for Jim Jarmusch's movie is just, I don't know, one of the best things ever. And so each one's like that too. Each one has like a unique thing that makes it so fun and special. You know, Kate Blanchett talking against herself, all this stuff. And you know, it's like they're all so short. Like if there's
I
one
know.
that like feels slow to you or isn't doing it for you, it's like just wait 5 minutes and you'll be on to the next one. Like I don't know. It's that's why I think it's such a good entry point versus something say like Dead Man, you know, which is like slow for 2 hours. Like I have a friend who was like, "Oh yeah, I didn't really like Jarmusch because I watched Dead Man once and it just didn't do anything for me." And I'm like, I mean, I can see that. I really would not have
Yeah.
recommended that as your first one. So this is like great because it's like again, it's so short. Like if this thing is too slow for you, like you'll be on to the next one in no time. So no worries.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because rewatching it for this, I had forgotten how quick they pass through. Like by
Mhm.
the time you're fully settled, they're like, okay, on to the next.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like, they ran out of story. It just feels like, well, that's the natural end to that conversation. So before we get into the actual vignettes, I thought it was interesting that Jarmusch said that only through line is just that because he was being asked, what ties these all together. He's like, nothing really other than people having conversations. But
Hmm.
he's like, I just wanted to show people having conversations. It's just the middle of their day. We just stepped in and then we stepped out of that conversation. And I like that a lot.
Yeah, it's funny he said that. I mean, he might be selling himself a little bit short, but
Mhm.
you know, because there are like little things that do tie together eventually once you like step back and like think about it for a second, which will come up. But like, yeah, I definitely think he made some effort to like have at least common themes or common ideas that like reiterate throughout the different segments. And you know, the snapshot element of it is something I love about Jarmusch in general. I think that's probably why this is my favorite, is because he's, you know, just all he wanted to do was just like capture people in the most mundane, but like silly way possible. And I probably should have mentioned this in my, you know, growing up origins with Jim Jarmusch story, but
Mhm.
I grew up in Austin, Texas, which is
Oh, nice.
very like kind of weird mundane place in a lot of ways. Like I don't know if you've ever seen like Slacker. I'm sure you've seen Slacker.
Mhm.
But like similar kind of ethos of just like, you know, normal people slacking around town, drinking coffee, doing nothing with their lives, you know, and I just love that shit. Like it just reminds me
Oh,
of
same.
home. So anyways, yeah, I find all that to be great and entertaining. So maybe that's just me.
No, I mean, hey, so do I. This is like my cup of tea or cup of coffee, to be honest. So I love just people hanging out. But we'll get into the first vignette, which is called Strange to Meet You. You've mentioned it a couple of times. So this is Stephen Wright, Roberto Benigni, and it's interesting because I don't think I realized that before this watch and doing a bit of research that it was originally shot for SNL, which is so funny to have thought of Jarmusch shooting anything
Mm,
for SNL, but it's
yeah.
obviously it was that time when the 80s and the SNL era was very interesting. They were trying different things. So I don't think they'd have Jarmusch on now,
Nope.
but it makes sense for the 80s to have them on. And I like this segment a lot. It's really funny to see, anything about these two actors, these two people who they are. They basically kind of have, it seems like polar opposite personalities, but then they do have a said, those nervous, quirks. And I find this interesting. This story is so funny and interesting. Roberto's character is so eager to just, make the other guy happy that he goes to his dentist appointment for him. I think it sets up the story of the film so nicely because it really
Mm.
sets the tone for it. I know how you feel about this segment.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an absolutely perfect tone setter for what's to
Hmm.
come. I think it's also the shortest one. I could be wrong about that, but it definitely flies by real quick. Yeah, I mean, there's something about their anxious energy that is just so palpable, so awkward. God, like It's so hard to make sense of like how they're existing and like talking, like who talks like this.
I
And
know.
I think it's like a great way to like get you on the wavelength for what's gonna come. Like this movie is
Yeah.
so awkward. Every single one of these conversations is awkward, and this one just like throws you right into the fire. It's like this is
Hmm.
gonna be really uncomfortably awkward for most of this. And here are like the two most jittery, anxious, awkward people you could possibly sit with for 5 minutes.
It's so funny because I don't think I would have even thought of them as being similar until you see them together. They kind of have a similar look to them also, just
Hmm.
like their frazzled hair
Yes,
and like,
yes, yeah,
thin bodies that they've
kind of
got
gaunt.
going on. Yeah,
Hmm.
very much really the best way to open this film for sure. I think that the awkwardness that's in it, when you think, because I've been talking to other people about Jarmusch and Wes Anderson has come up quite a few times as they're kind of mirrors, but opposite sides of those mirrors. And they do have that awkwardness to them. One seems more naturally awkward, and the other one seems more obviously stylized
Yeah.
awkward. And the Wes Anderson, and I love Wes Anderson. This is not a slight to him, but it's interesting the way people might gravitate to one type of awkward versus the other, and how some people it vibes for both of them, but maybe not so much.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel. I hadn't thought of that. I definitely prefer the more authentic awkwardness over the sort of staged awkwardness of Wes Anderson. But
Hmm.
I also like Wes Anderson, so I don't want to knock it
No,
either.
yeah. It's just so different, but they are so. But I always think about how they're kind of doing the same thing, but like they're like yin and yang, if I'm going to
Mm,
use, a very old saying.
totally. Yeah, no, I can totally see that.
The next segment is twins. So we've got the Lee twins, who are the siblings of Spike Lee.
I know. It's crazy.
Love seeing them. This is one that I think for me, if there's only one part of this film where it looks so a little bit jarring, might not be the right word, but visually different, is those two when they come right back to back because the way Robbie Mueller shoots this one is just so beautiful. He really
Mm.
captures everyone so beautifully. Not that the other one isn't, it is. It's just different eras, obviously. I really like this one. I love the story of this and their back and forth banter. And whether you know they're actual twins or not doesn't really matter because they're kind of, I love how they're just called, because I usually watch movies with subtitles. So they say evil twin, good twin on there on the
I didn't
subtitles.
know that. That's great.
Yeah. Which I think is great that they listed that. But yeah, they're going back and forth, and we get Steve Buscemi coming in with a interesting accent that he's pulling off in this one. And it's funny because this one was filmed at the same time that they filmed Mystery Train.
Mystery
It's
Train,
they
right?
had the actors there and they brought it for I don't know, how do you feel about
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually didn't catch on until this watch that they were in Memphis. Like they mentioned at some
mm,
point that like, oh, they're actually in Memphis. And I was like, oh yeah, they were in Memphis in Mystery Train. But otherwise, I think it's great. It's interesting the visual switch that you mentioned to Robbie. Despite that being very true, you can see that he was emulating a lot of the like visual techniques, I think, of the first one, like a lot of the overhead, like bird's eye view shots of like the table and them like fiddling with the coffee and cigarettes on the table.
yeah.
Like he kept that and still did it his own way, but like still did it the same kind of
Mm,
idea of that, right? And then yeah, these twins are so funny. I think they're
yeah.
hilarious. That like the one twin just like is so concerned with how the other one is like copying them, and the fact that they kind of hate each other but are like clearly so like linked,
Yeah.
like they have this adorable love-hate relationship that is just full of tension.
Hmm.
And then Steve Buscemi is just the perfect foil for those two people. They're like this like flaming, fire in a pot, and he's just like a cup of water come
Yeah.
to put them out. He's just totally oblivious. Cannot read the room at all and does not give a shit about any of their dynamics with each other. He's just
Hmm.
like, oh, I'm just Steve Buscemi. I'm here to, break the ice and chill everybody down a little bit. So, yeah, this one's a lot of fun for me. It's got a lot of ups and downs, and
Hmm.
yeah, they're both very entertaining to watch. One thing I'll mention, I don't think we said this already, but what's his Sink? How do you say his name? It's Cinque.
Yeah, I've been hearing it different ways, and I really tried to do my research and trying to like get it right, but everyone says it so differently. So
Okay,
I've been
yeah.
saying think.
So, yeah, I'm probably butchering it by saying that way, and I apologize to any listeners who
Yeah.
are going to get mad at me. But I thought he is the only one in the movie that appears multiple times. which I
Hmm.
realized on this past watch too. Nobody repeats except for him. He's the only one who shows up, I think, in like 5 vignettes from now. And he's like 10 years older, which is kind of jarring. But
Yeah.
it's like the one time that the sort of like isolated alternate universe element of this movie it gets broken a little bit when you see an older version of him later on.
I love that you brought that up because I think the first time, I don't even know if I would have realized it was him again, but on this watch, I was like, oh my God, it obviously is him, but he's a bit older in it. So yeah, we will move on to the next one. But I think the last thing I want to say about twins is that, as you said, it's Memphis. Elvis is a big chatter, big thing that they're talking about in it. It's obviously a big part of Mystery Train. And I think what Jarmusch does very well is he's very conscious of like race relations, and that's brought up in this. And it's never overbearing. It's just like, yeah, of course these characters would mention that. And it's not like they're
Right.
trying to teach you a lesson. They're just being like, well, that's the facts. And then it
Hmm.
ends and you're like, okay, at least he's acknowledging it. So I like that's
Totally.
like a through line through a lot of his films for
I agree.
sure.
Yeah, he really like gets people and like lets people be people, whoever they would actually be, whatever they would actually say. Like I think he gets that more than anybody else.
Which is just like the mark of a good listener and good reader.
Totally.
Sorry, and good writer.
Mhm.
So yeah. Next segment is Somewhere in California.
Mm.
And on this watch, this was my favorite one for
Yeah.
sure. I just really vibed with this one. It's like Iggy
Yep.
Pop, Tom Waits, and they're so good together because Iggy Pop is so sweet. And Tom Waits is such a
Hmm.
dickhead in this movie
Hmm.
or in this
Yep.
segment. And I'd forgotten how much of a dick he is. And he's to the point where you're like, I know someone like this. Everyone knows someone who's just like always playing devil's advocate or was always just trying to push someone's buttons for no reason other than that's how
Right.
they like to interact with people. I know this is a popular one. This won an award at Cannes. Won the short film Palme d'Or. I could see why. It's definitely one of the more memorable ones, and you've got two really big musicians in it, and he loves using musicians in his films and making them act and be a bit more different, even though they're playing versions of themselves in this. But yeah, curious to hear what your thoughts are on Summer in California.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of like an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, like the kind of like
Yeah.
fictionalized version of yourself
Hmm.
in the most like self-deprecating version or way, right? But yeah, couldn't agree more. This is one of the best, and I think the completely different wavelengths that these two people are on is why it's so good.
Yeah.
Um, it's just that Tom Waits has big Joe Pesci and Goodfellas energy,
Yeah.
like the funny how am I funny? Just but he's not like in on the joke necessarily. Like he's just like that, He
Yeah.
easily offended, like just way too serious. And then as you said, like Iggy Pop is just trying to be buddies.
I
And I
know.
what I think is so funny about this is that you watch Iggy Pop's like confidence and desire to be in this room just like slowly dwindle throughout
I
the
know.
course of the interaction. At first he's just like, "Hey man, how's it going?" And then over time he just like gets quieter. He
I
starts giving
know.
these like wide-eyed looks of like, "Ah, geez, this is not going well." Before like finally he's the one who's like, I gotta go, man. Like I gotta get out of this situation." And he's the
Yeah.
one who leaves despite being excited to be there in the first place.
I know. I mean, he puts on a great performance. I mean, we've seen Tom Waits act over the years and even in Jarmusch's films, but
Hmm.
Iggy Pop, sometimes he pops up in films. I always think of Crybaby when I think
Hmm.
of Iggy Pop in films, but I think he's great here. He really, as you said, you see it in his face where he's just feeling defeated, where he's like, okay, this is just going to keep going on. So I might as well remove myself from it. And I just love the way it's shot. They're the kind of dingy bar that they're in with the lighting that's going
The
on in the
crappy
background. It's
jukebox.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, it's great. I love that whole little segment there where Iggy's like, oh, they don't have your music here. And at the end, Tom's
Yep.
like, well, they don't have his music either.
Yeah, yeah, like Tom's clearly like in a dick measuring contest all
Yeah.
the time with everybody. And I will say my favorite bit from maybe from the whole movie, but like especially in this one is the whole like, well, because I quit cigarettes, I can
Yeah.
just have one, I can just have a cigarette because I quit, it's no big deal to just have one.
Yeah.
And Iggy just goes along with it and they just are sitting there smoking, talking about how they hate cigarettes. It's so funny.
This is one that I think they could all be watched in isolation and you
Mhm.
would still get so much out of them. This is one that like to rewatch just on its own every now and again, where you're like, I'm just feeling like I want to watch those two people interact for a
I
bit.
agree. Like if I had 5 minutes to show one of these vignettes to somebody who had never seen it before, this is probably the one I'd show them.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. The next vignette is Those Things Will Kill You. So we've got the two very Italian men
Mm-hmm.
in it looks like a restaurant takeout spot, and they're drinking coffee. One of them smoking. I will say, actually, because we haven't mentioned this yet, a lot of these were filmed, as we said prior, but when also people could smoke indoors.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it looks like weird actually watching it where you're like, yeah, that's not a thing. It's very, cinematic at this point. But a lot of these are filmed when you could actually smoke indoors, which is not a thing in most places in the world anymore. But these two are going at each other. They're obviously really old friends. One had quit smoking ages ago or has never smoked, and he's kind of berating his friend, being like, you need to give those things up. And they're going back and forth berating each other about their choices. Yeah, I like their dynamic, but I also like the young boy coming in. One of the guy's sons comes in and kind of just, breaks that up, because it could be a lot to hear two men kind of yell at each other for a
Yeah.
minute. What are your thoughts on this
Yeah, I
one?
definitely think it's maybe one of the more overlooked ones, maybe like one of the lesser of them, but I still really like it. Like I think, it just kind of harkens to Jim's desire to like capture very unique people, right? Like he like picks like the most like fundamentally unique and strange people to highlight. And I think these are two like very quirky, like fun dudes to watch, like who doesn't love like a very authentic Upper East Side New York Italian old guy, right?
Yeah.
Like and for two of them to go at it is just one of the most entertaining things ever. I mean, that's Scorsese's bread and butter, right? Like we love it. Yeah, I think it's a funny thing that he decided to make the son like essentially mute and only communicates through like hand gestures, and that
Yeah.
he's kind of a pest, so he's just like constantly getting on his like poor Italian dad's nerves like all the time, clearly, and that this
Yeah.
like guy is just like going bald, having to deal with a son who's always asking him for money and stressing him out. Yeah, it's just like fun. Like this is like the kind of thing I love to watch. Like I could watch
Hmm.
the people from like a Goodfellas or a Sopranos or any like
Hmm.
those type of people. I could just watch them live their day-to-day lives. I think they will always be an entertaining like type of character to me. The other thing I'll say about this one is I think it's the first time that this refrain comes up about cigarettes and coffee being like an unhealthy lunch,
Yeah.
which you'll hear a couple times throughout these vignettes. But like him being shamed for his cigarette smoking is like, I think starts here and becomes like a thing that pops up throughout.
Hmm.
So yeah, just want to throw that out there.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think that's where it does start, because we do hear it throughout. And as much as the previous one, they're talking about how they have given up smoking. It's obviously like mentally they haven't yet. And that's why they're,
Mm-hmm.
doing it in this one. But this is kind of where I think the cultural shift also is starting to happen. And it's reflected in this one, which I find interesting. The other thing I find interesting, you said, I think that it's one of the more overlooked ones, and I think it is. And I wonder, in part, is it because at this point we've seen such recognizable faces, and a lot of people might not know who these actors are, so that might play into it. Maybe not, but I feel like if it was two actors, the two Italian actors that a lot of people knew, I think it would be maybe talked about a little bit more. But yeah, I don't
Yeah, I
know.
hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. Maybe it's just a little bit more straightforward, right? Like this is
Hmm.
maybe more of like a real snapshot of like two people existing in their day-to-day lives, where most of these so far have felt like kind of like surreal and otherworldly, if that makes sense. Like I don't
Yeah.
know, like the Iggy Pop and Tom Waits things feels like a liminal space where like
Hmm.
this sort of thing would never happen in real life, or just there's something like off about it, something kind of like, dare I
Yeah.
say, Lynchian about it. And so far they've all kind of been like this. And this one feels just a little bit more like mundane, I guess.
Hmm. And I think it segues pretty nicely into the next one, which is Renee. And
Hmm.
this one's interesting because I think it's also a quite very short, this one, but it's a woman on her own. She's at a cafe. She's reading a magazine, drinking her coffee.
I
And
love Renee. God.
right, I love this one. And I always forget how much I love it until it comes on. You're like, oh, yes, I'm glad this one's finally here. And the server comes and, sees that the coffee looks like it's been half drank and pours more coffee on it. And I love that she's like, I wish you hadn't done that. I just gotten it, perfect. And I think that's the thesis of this short. She just wants things to be done her own way, and which is only just she just wants to be left alone.
Yeah.
And I think he's commenting on the fact that women alone can never really be alone because they're always just going to be people wanting to kind of figure out why they're alone, what they need, what assistance or help they need. And I think that's the thing that comes up a little bit in his other films. I was thinking of Night on Earth and like Winona Ryder being a taxi driver. And it's like, that was commented on it being like, oh, you don't often see taxi drivers being
Female
women.
taxi drivers,
Yeah, let alone, young taxi drivers. And you don't often see, even though you do, but it's still like remarked upon if you see a woman on her own drinking. So yeah, I don't know how you feel about that theme and how it kind of works within his other films.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of nailed it. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about where, Jim like understands different cultures and different types of people other than like the white male experience. He understands them very well. Like he knows how to let other people be themselves, but also he understands the kind of experiences that they go through. Like, and I think this is just another perfect example. Like he knows what it's like to some degree, obviously not firsthand, but he knows what it's like to be like a young woman in their 20s, 30s, like living day-to-day life. And he just captures it so beautifully here. But, on the flip side, she's also clearly kind of a badass. Like the way she stands up for herself, the way she kind of like shoos this dude away. And then eventually you learn as you finally get an overhead shot of her table that she is looking at a magazine of guns. Handguns and rifles and stuff. Like that's her task for the day. I think that's like one of Jarmusch's best traits is that he fully understands other walks of life and like lets them shine. I think it really punches it in with the waiter because he just can't stop himself from coming back to the table. And he like feels so uncomfortable. That's like such a dude thing to do, right? It's to just constantly keep coming back and like being like, well, I'm sorry about the thing and like blah 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 blah. It's like, dude, just fuck off. Like he doesn't want you here, And so I feel like every female friend I know has had that experience, you know what I mean? Just like some dude who cannot just like leave you alone. Please just go away.
No, I agree. And what you said about Jarmusch just really understanding other walks of life. And it's just so obvious in a lot of his work and also covering Ghost Dog. And I think it's just so obvious in that. Like nothing ever seems like he's co-opting other cultures. Yeah, exactly. He's just very good at observing and listening. I think this one's a really important one. But we get into the next one, which is No Problem. I find this one a lot of fun. I think it's funny. When I was reading other people's thoughts on each vignette, this is always ranked lower than the other ones. I think people don't vibe with it as much. Maybe they find it a little bit annoying because it's repetitive. But I just thought it's funny because I know both of those type of people who are just like, I want to be near someone, but I don't know how to do it. So I just kind of make it seem like it's an emergency to be like, hey, I want to see you. And the other person is just so anxious. And it's like something obviously wrong. And I just love the whole thing. Don't worry about it. I'll be around when you need to tell me. And the other person's just like, dude, there's nothing going on. And that back and forth. I think it's really cool seeing those two actors because I've seen them in quite a few things. I've seen them in other Jarmusch films as well. And just to see their dynamic, they seem like they've been friends forever. And I think it's obviously a testament to their performance, but it's also Jarmusch who's so good at pairing people together.
Absolutely.
Which I think he's very good at pairing actors together.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, exactly what you said. Like these people have known each other for so long that, it's a weird like double-sided thing where like they know each other so well clearly, but they also like because they're so close can't seem to like break past this like wall. Like they just keep fighting each other on this issue. Like there's something wrong. No, there's nothing wrong. There's something wrong. Nope, nothing wrong. And like because they're so friendly with each other, they're able to just kind of like ping pong back and forth until one of them gives up. It's a very specific type of friendship that I think all of us have had at least once or twice.
Oh yeah,
it makes it very relatable. I will add one of my favorite small details or bits comes from this one. And that's the very beginning when the first guy's by himself and he's just kind of doing nothing. And then he takes out a pair of die and just rolls them just out of curiosity and then puts them away. It's such a small moment that like probably means nothing, but it was just hilarious to me that he just like carries a pair
Yeah.
of die around with him and just like throws them whenever he wants, just out of curiosity.
I like that part too. It also just looks really cool on like the checkered table.
It
So
does.
that's when you get that another of those, overhead shots. Okay, cousins. We've got an actress playing two characters, and it's Cate Blanchett that we all know. It's very capable, and she's great in this. She's playing a version of herself, and then she's playing another actress or another person who's Kate, the character's cousin. What I found interesting about this one and reading about it is that he filmed the Kate scenes, and then Kate wanted a couple days to just get into character, so he let her do that, and they filmed the other scenes
Mhm.
afterwards so that she could fully separate herself from the other one. And it just looks so seamless, seeing them
Yep.
together. And she's the person to do it. She's the person to play dual characters. You don't question it. You're like, yeah, makes
It's always
sense.
funny to me that like, most of these vignettes are super like low budget, kind of artsy, kind of like small fry and a little silly, but like the one that's like an actually like really high, art piece is like the one with Cate Blanchett, right? Like she's
Yeah.
one of the few people who could probably pull this off. And oh man, it's so entertaining to watch her play against herself.
Yeah.
Because I feel like both of these versions of her are very authentic and like
Hmm.
two like if you were to split her personality into like light and dark, this is exactly what would happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, this kind of like, I don't want to say trashy, but like, like from the streets version of
Yeah.
Kate with that kind of like harsh Australian accent, and then this like
Hmm.
very like posh, wealthy actress version of Kate. And it almost feels to me like she's kind of like having an inner dialogue, like the real Cate Blanchett is like having an inner dialogue like with herself about these two kind of sides of her personality. I could be totally like making that up, but that's just the way I like think about it when I watch it, is that like this isn't like a real scene. This is like something that's happening like in Cate Blanchett's subconscious. You know what I mean? And I don't know, it's just like a fun lens to watch it through.
No, I think that's a really great way to view it. I think, it's weird because they had never worked together before, Kate and Jim. So, which
I thought you were gonna
when
say
you're
Kate
looking
and
at the,
Kate.
yeah, Kate and Gabe, but also Kate and Jim. And most of the actors we've seen so far have had worked with Jim before and post. But this is the first time he and Kate worked together. So they obviously had some sort of rapport. They must have known each other, and he'd been looking for the right venue, to put her in. But I think I like to think of it as like maybe the cousin is like younger version of Kate and how she
Hmm.
used to be before she
I could see
got
that.
her success. Maybe she was, a bit of a rocker herself at some point in her
A
life.
wild child, or yeah.
Yeah. Which I'd like to think she
Yeah,
could
some
be.
of the like misunderstandings are very like interesting to me, like about the like gifts that are given that are clearly just like
Hmm.
freebies that rich Kate had. The mean Kate, the dark Kate, calls her out for not listening to her boyfriend's mixtape or whatever, but then
Yeah.
you realize like, oh, she never actually sent it. So they're both just kind of like bad at like having this relationship in different ways. And yeah, it's just like two ships sailing in the night.
I always feel like he's very good at showing both sides of each human being that he has
Mm,
on screen, but he
right.
never feels like he's judging them. At least I didn't feel like he was judging either of these characters. They were just human
Just who they
and
were.
trying to
Yeah.
be who they were. Next one is obviously a really big one because we're thinking about this film is released in 2003, 2004, depending where you were in the world. But 2003 is a huge year for two of these people that are in this vignette. So this one's called Jack Shows Meg His Tesla Coil. So the White Stripes, they're still huge. Everyone still knows who they are. But at that
Yeah.
time, they were, I remember just how enormous they were. If you grew up with the White Stripes,
Mhm.
like, I definitely did. You remember what they looked like then versus what they look, not that they look so different, it's just, age, different eras that they've gone through, specifically Jack. But it's so fun seeing them in their black, red, and white era still,
Mhm.
and how young and youthful they look and what the impact would have been for people seeing it at that time, because I didn't see it in 2003, this film, but I definitely would have freaked out if I had seen and been like, oh my God, it's a white stripe.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's such a interesting, time capsule of like what was probably like the biggest band, culturally
Mhm.
at the time. I mean, that might not be true, but like it felt that way. Like it felt that
Yeah.
way around that time period that this was like the most important band of the time. I think I'm a bass player, and Seven Nation
Mhm.
Army was probably like the first song I ever learned on bass.
Yeah.
And you're right, that like look that they have in this movie is like how they will forever be enshrined,
Mhm.
in our minds, I think, no matter how many times Jack White like changes his style. He'll
Yeah.
always be that to us, right? Us millennials. Yeah, this was crazy. It was also like weird because, well, two things. One, like they were famous, but like were they that famous just yet? Like they were just kind of still on their rise at that point, like around when this was filmed, like early 2000s. Like they were getting there, but like I feel like they really hit their stride like around 2004, 2005.
Mhm.
So it was kind of early days. And that gets into the second thing I thought that was interesting is that Jim is very interested in like newer talent, and he's always expressed interest in like finding who like the new young people are, and like utilizing them or working with them. And to me, this is just a great example of him like realizing like, oh, these two people are going to be huge, they're also really cool and funny, I want them in my next thing. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
like for him to have the foresight to know how important the white strips would be is just impressive to me. Like he's got such a great, I guess, sense for talent.
Hmm. No, I think that's interesting because as you were saying it, I was like, wait, what year was Elephant? So I just Googled it there. And it was 2003, but obviously this is filmed before 2003.
Yeah.
And Elephant's really when they really, really blew up. A lot of us know their earlier stuff than that, but Elephant is really when they made it to who they were.
Yep.
And so as you're saying, he had the foresight to be like, these people are going to be
Huge.
even bigger than this movie, to be honest. That I think is really funny. And I just love their dynamic. And it's because they're playing off of when they pretended they were still brother and sister. And you see that in this too, because they're playing brother and sister in that. And I think about that often where I'm like, if you tried to explain it to younger generations that, yeah, there was this band, they were actually married before, but they pretended to be siblings. It's like, yeah, that's
Oh, it's
so
so
of the
weird.
time.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember the first time I watched this, like I said, was like 2005, 2006 maybe. And at the time, I think I was still under the impression that they were siblings. And
Mhm.
they kind of mentioned being siblings in this movie. And it just like it took me when I rewatched it just now or like a couple days ago, it was like it took me right back to like
Yeah,
how awkward it was to learn that they were married.
I know. That's
Good
2000s
times.
for you. Could
Yeah.
not do that anymore with good reason, I think. But it was fun
Yeah.
at the time. Getting into the other cousins, this is cousins, question
With a
mark.
question
Then
mark.
we've
Yeah.
got this one I find really fun too. We got Alfred Molina and we got Steve Coogan.
Mm,
And those are also actors who haven't worked with Jarmusch before. And it's great because they're obviously playing themselves. And I like people think what they might, about Steve Coogan, but I think that Steve Coogan is always going to be who he is. And he's never afraid of making fun of himself and
yeah.
coming across as an ass on screen because
Yes.
he's very much so
He just is.
in this
Yeah.
film. That's just he's like, this is this is my vibe. I'm just gonna go for it and I'm not gonna try and be anything other than that. And they do it so well, the playing the back and forth. And I love being in the trajectory of this story. Curious to hear about your thoughts on this
Yeah, I
one.
think either second to or tied with the Tom Waits Iggy Pop one. This is probably
Hmm.
my favorite or close to favorite, just because of some of the things you already laid out. The fact that Steve Coogan's so authentically an asshole,
Yeah.
just so cocky, I think is what it is. Like he's just so fucking full of himself. And it's just like kind of a delight to watch him just lean into it a little bit and like
Hmm.
you said, make fun of himself in a way. And then Alfred Molina just being so like, I don't know, kind of like has this kind of like schoolgirl, like he's just so like peppy and excited and
Yeah.
kind of crushing on Steve Coogan for like the first two-thirds of it. It's just kind of adorable to watch. And I love the awkwardness of like the first part of this segment where Alfred Molina like knows everything about Steve Coogan and is so excited to be here, and Steve is just like, who are you? Like
Yeah.
I know of things that you've been in, I think. And then it's really like the flip, like the switch that happens near the end, that it's just so great. Like
Hmm.
I don't know who thought of that, if that was like it was probably Jim writing the scenario, but like I don't know, there's just something about that switch that just like hits so hard for me, that like Alfred Molina is working with Spike Jones and Steve
Yeah.
Coogan realizes he's a piece of shit, and he's like, is it too late to give you my number? And
I
he's
know.
like, yeah, you fucked up, dude. And it's just like so triumphant for
Hmm.
poor Alfred Molina, who gets to walk away like the big man. And
Yeah.
I love that for Alfred Molina. Like
Same.
Go you.
No, I agree. I think it's so funny because I think he's also playing off the fact that people recognize his face, but probably even maybe to this day don't know his name if you're not someone who
Hmm.
watches film.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, I know that guy, don't know his name, but you probably definitely know Steve Coogan's name, and they're playing off of both those things that like
Yep.
Alfred Molina is obviously very successful, but he's not a household name. And I love that. I love his triumphant, even when he's on the phone with Spike. And obviously, everyone's first, at least I, even myself, I was like, oh, he's on the phone with Spike Lee when I first watched it. Steve Coogan
Hmm.
also thinks that. And he's like, Spike Jones, which is so funny. My favorite part of that, other than the triumphant ending for Melina, is when Steve offers Alfred a cigarette and he's like, they're French. I hope that's okay.
Hmm.
Just like it's the dick. Like no one
One of
cares.
my favorite parts is like right after that, where Alfred Molina takes it and then he just like pockets it,
Yeah.
and Steve Coogan's like, "Are you gonna smoke?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm just gonna save it for later." Like clearly,
Yeah.
like Alfred like took it out of politeness to like not be a part of the party or whatever, which I found a very lovable moment. But yeah, I mean everything you said, 100%. Yeah, it's again like Jarmusch really tapping into like who these actual people are in real life and just like
Mhm.
letting the context really like soak into the scene and not being afraid to like really look inwardly on who these people are in real life and using that for the sake of humor. And it just like it works so well between these two people. I can't imagine who else could have done this or who it could have been written for, but like these two people are just so perfect for this dynamic.
I know. I love it. I think that's why it's also one of the more
Yep.
memorable ones of the film. Another one, though, right after this is also quite memorable because you got three people who are a lot of people know. And this one's called Delirium.
Mm.
You got two members of the Wu-Tang Clan. You got the RZA and the Jizza. And we've got Bill Murray, Bill Murray, who's obviously huge. He's always been huge. And it's funny seeing him in this role because only Bill Murray could get away with it. It's somewhat similar to the Steve Buscemi part there, but Steve Buscemi is actually not playing himself in that one, whereas Bill Murray is very much himself, and he keeps saying, "Hey, don't tell anyone that I'm here." And they're like, we don't have to say it because everyone's gonna see you, and we all know who you are. What I like about this one, similar to the last one, is that they're drinking tea in this one. So you switch to tea because it's healthier for them, is
Hmm.
what they think. They say they don't smoke anymore, but then they're talking about all the weed they like to smoke. Bill Murray's in the background, chugging coffee right from the pot. It's just like a really funny, like really silly vignette, and it's just so much fun. And it's a great way to, doesn't wrap up because we still have another one after this, but it's a great way to get towards the end of the
Towards
film.
like the modern day too. It's starting to like really feel like, okay, like yeah, we're like fully in the 2000s now.
Yeah.
I love that the Wu-Tang are the ones to be drinking tea and thinking about their
Yeah.
health, which is really funny to me. Yeah, what do they keep calling Bill Murray? They call him your Groundhog Day ghost busting ass
Yeah.
Bill Murray or something like that. Which
Yeah.
is great. Yeah, I don't know why Bill Murray's like incognito in this coffee shop, but it's the kind of thing I feel like again only Jim Jarmusch could pull off. It's just like his
hmm
thing. Like he creates these like alternate universes for real
hmm
life people or his characters that like are purely his own weird little world or his version of the world. And this
Yeah.
is a fun little thing he came up with. I don't know if you noticed this, but I can't remember. I think it was RZA has a little hat on and has the
Ghost
ghost
Dog.
dog on the hat. Yeah, yeah. I thought that was a cool
I
little moment.
noticed it on this watch. I don't think I've ever noticed it before that. That is cool. Yeah, this is a fun one, and it's funny because post this, I mean, who knows? Maybe he had been doing this before too, but Bill Murray, you always hear of random stories of Bill Murray showing up and bartending at some random bar. So that's just like a thing he likes to do where he's like, yeah, I'm just gonna do this, and I know that people are gonna know me who I am, but I'm just gonna do it because I'm
Is
bored.
a perfect pairing with Jim. And it's funny you mentioned Wes Anderson earlier because I
Mm,
feel like Bill Murray like has a very specific like vibe and deadpan that works just perfectly with both of them, but like in
hmm
clearly different ways, as you already said. But I think you really see that shine through here. Like the thing that makes him good for Wes Anderson movies is also the thing that makes him very good for Jim
Yeah.
Jarmusch movies.
Exactly. I'm glad that you mentioned that also because he does it in both, but he's catering it to each
Yep.
director because they both
He
require
gets it.
different skills. Yeah. So good performance, but we're on to the last one now, which is Champagne. And this
Um,
one, I love it. It's just so heartwarming and also heartbreaking at the same time. I don't know if it's just because they're older men, and it makes me a little bit sad sometimes to see such old people still having to
Yeah.
work hard, and they don't seem like they're unhappy. They just seem like this is like literally a 10-minute break that they have in their life, and they're just chatting over coffee that's not good. As we said, with the very first one, it was a great way to open this film. I think this is a great way to end this film. At the end of the day, these are just regular human beings. And what you've been
Yeah.
watching, some of this seems like it's like, as you said, a bit fantastical, if you want to say, when you see like Iggy Pop or you see the White Stripes or Bill Murray. But at the end of the day, these are just regular conversations with human beings, no matter their status. So I really,
Yeah.
really love this
Yeah.
one.
I couldn't agree with more. I couldn't agree more with all those sentiments. Yeah, there's something a little bit, it brings you back down to reality when you see like older folks working like menial labor jobs, and you're like,
Mm,
as you said, like, oh yeah, we've like left the surreal world of Bill Murray bartending, and now we're like back in the real world. Jim does like a really good job, I think, of like covering every sort of kind of corner of society throughout all 11 vignettes. Obviously there's so
hmm
much more, but he goes from the very bottom to the top and back down to the bottom. And to me, yeah, it's a bit of a sobering meditation, I think, on what it is to be alive and live your life. I know Jim's very, very much a sort of existential, philosophical, almost like Buddhist type of dude. And so to me, it
hmm
makes a lot of sense that he would end this like weird, quirky thing this way. As you said, like we start off very high anxiety, and then
Yeah.
we kind of end on this a slower, more reflective moment. And I think it just works. It just works really well.
It's just, yeah, great bookends to a really great film. We've covered the vignettes now, but wondering if there's any parts of the film that we haven't chatted about before we move to the last segment that you want to bring
I
up.
think like really the only other, we talked about a little bit, but just the visual style and
Hmm
the way he crafts spaces, I think is one of my favorite things about Jarmusch movies. Like so many of these places don't feel like anywhere you would ever go into. Like the very first
hmm
place just looks like kind of a warehouse, but it's like made to look like a coffee shop. The place where Steve Coogan and Alfred Molina go like kind of looks like the top part of an office or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just like he has a strange, unique way of creating these spaces that are just like very, very dusty, very bizarre, and feel like totally lived in a strange way, right? Like nothing ever feels like a set, which I love about Jim Jarmusch movies, and this one really is like a great example of that. Like nothing feels like it was constructed, other than like they found some abandoned place and set up a couple chairs and a coffee table,
Yeah.
right? You know what I mean? He's like, yeah, this works, shoot it here. And I kind of like love that sort of guerrilla filmmaking aspect of it, because what it does is it really like helps everything else in the film like stand out, and it gives it more of that authentic flavor that I think he's trying to inject into every one of these awkward interactions, right? By
Yeah.
making the spaces just very analog and dusty, and super, super raw. It really
hmm
contributes to the sort of like raw emotiveness of each of these people and what he's trying to get across in all of them. So I don't know. Yeah, I just like, I love that aspect of it. And the fact that he kind of has kept that ethos throughout not only just these vignettes, but like every movie he's ever done.
I was gonna say that was my next point, that like you see it a lot in this one, but it's just been a thing that he's always done and he's continued to do. Like setting is so important to him, but
Yeah.
everything, I'm thinking of even like Patterson and the house
Hmm.
that they live in. It seems like these people actually live there. It seems like
Yep.
people, it's not, as you said, not a set. They're like, it's just throw random stuff. It's like these characters would have these things on their walls, or
Yep.
they would have that couch. Yeah, so that's Coffee and Cigarettes. I mean, it's a great film. It's just so rewatchable, right? Like,
Hmm.
and as you've been saying, at each watch, you get something different on each time, and it just never gets old. But I don't want to stop talking about Jarmusch. I have two more questions for you. So the last
Great.
segment is end credits. First question, you've actually kind of touched upon it before, but I'm wondering what your final answer is for it. So if someone is asking for a recommendation of where to start with Jarmusch, what film are you recommending in his body of work, and what's the reason for that
Yeah, I
one?
mean, it would either be Coffee and Cigarette or it would be Night on Earth, because I do think Jim Jarmusch is better understood through smaller moments. if that makes
Mm,
sense. So, I think he really shines in just like the like low level interactions between people. And I think the best way to understand that is to see his smaller stuff, his vignettes, whether here or in Night on Earth. You kind of get these, just more day-to-day mundane interactions, but there's so much more than that, and you get that very quickly, right? Like you very quickly realize like this is more than just two people talking. Like there's something really meaningful happening here. And then I think once you like kind of click into that, you can go
hmm.
back to something like A Dead Man or A Stranger Than Paradise, which are much longer,
Yeah.
and like really appreciate the pace, because a lot of his movies are slow, and you can see like the little details and the meaning behind every little tiny interaction that if you didn't know that about his style might just completely go over your head, right? But because he's like kind of locked into a tight, short story format here, he like has to get it across much faster. And
Uh-huh.
I think that's like a great lesson for people watching, like I think this is a great way to appreciate slow mundane cinema,
Hmm. Yep.
is either this and Night on Earth. It's a good primer.
They're both great places to start. I think I like that answer of these ones are great entryways to fully understand his scope.
Yeah.
And then you can go to stuff like, as you said, like Dead Man and Your Friend, having watched that first. I could see also how that would be a turn off for
Yeah.
someone.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I haven't seen Dead Man in a hot minute, but I remember watching it and liking it. But it's not one I go back to as often as these ones, not for, any other reason than I find these ones a little bit more entertaining than
Yes. Yeah.
Dead Man and definitely more easily watched. But it's still a great film, and Stranger Than Paradise is still a great film. And some of his other slower stuff are also great. But I think it's important to kind of show someone for the first time what everything that they have to offer and like the
Yeah.
humor side of Jarmusch that's not necessarily there in Dead Man as
Yeah,
much.
and sometimes like the humor is there, but it's just like it's so much more covert, and versus
Yeah.
here where it's a lot more overt, and so you kind of like get a better idea for it here, and you can dial into it. And so again, when you go back to those things, you're like, oh, I see what you're doing.
Mhm.
Like you see where he's like writing in the humor again in those smaller moments. So
Yeah, I definitely agree with those choices. I'm interested to hear what your double bill answer would be. So if you can, and you can give more than one film if you have, a couple options that you're thinking of, but if you're pairing this film with another one, you're creating a double bill, what film would you match it with or films? And what's the reason why you're pairing them
I think I
together?
gave it away already, but I'll reiterate. I'd probably pair this with Slacker, the Richard
Yeah.
Linklater movie. To me, these are like, two peas in a pod. Both are kind of like capturing this very 90s dusty, mundane lifestyle thing that I find so absolutely charming. And could
Hmm.
watch for days, and that like nothing feels too important, but everything like feels very important to the people who are experiencing it, and you pass through it so quickly, and you really get like a full picture of like a place or a culture or a community as a result of it. That's just like my vibe, and I think these two
Hmm.
movies really go hand in hand together very well. The only other one I thought to maybe pair this with was Repo Man, which is a totally different movie, but I think have a similar sort of level of humor, so similar like
Hmm.
type of humor, and then a similar kind of like reality meets surreality
Hmm.
in
Yep.
a similar way, right? Where it's like this is the real world, but sometimes weird shit just happens.
Yeah.
It's inconceivable, and you just kind of have to go with it. So yeah, those would probably be my potential choices.
I think those are great. I love both those movies. I especially Repo Man's in my top 10. I'm obsessed with
Yes,
Repo
yes,
Man.
love
It's
Repo Man.
like very much my personality is Repo Man. Another Robbie Mueller. I know I keep
Yeah.
talking about him, but he also shot that one. I went along with my pairings with kind of hangout films too, but they're more on the move than this one is because a lot of these are stagnant. People are just sitting.
Mhm.
So I
Yeah.
was like, okay, what's on the move ones that are people talking and kind of hanging out? So one is more serious and the other one is funny. So the serious one I thought of was Certified Copy, the Kiarostami film,
Oh yeah.
and
Mhm.
it's definitely more serious than this one. There are elements of humor, but it's more not serious in a like depressing way. Well, some of it is depressing, but it's just more so like you seeing two people chat about things that are obviously upsetting one another and they're traveling from like city to city or location within the city, and we're just watching them talk the whole time. They're just walking to one, monument to another as they're going around. So I thought that's interesting to pair it with. And the other one's also a travel one, but it's definitely more of a comedy. And it's Il Sorpasso, the Dino Risi film from 1962.
I don't know that one.
I think you'd like it. It's very funny. I love it a lot. It's two guys who just end up having to be paired together, and you can tell that they probably, shouldn't be together, but different circumstances, they end up getting paired together, and they're trying to make it from point A to B. A lot of stupid nonsense happens to them in between, but it's a lot of that just watching them having those conversations where you're seeing like these personalities clashing. So I think those would be interesting ones to pair it with if you want to highlight the more serious parts of this film or the more comedic part of this film.
On the watch list it goes.
Yeah. I think it's great. But Trevor, thank you so much for talking to me about Jarmusch and coffee and cigarettes. I had a great time.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much. I'm wearing my Jarmusch shirt today. I'm glad we got to talk about it. It was fun.
Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia and Renée, with intro music by Lamar Walker. If you liked what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcasts, and stay tuned for our next episode on Down by Law.